Welcome to Ancient Echoes, where the past isn't silent, it just speaks in a different register. I'm Chelsea, and today we're kicking off our deep dive into one of the most enigmatic and colorfully misunderstood people in the ancient European history, the Celts. Now, when you hear Celts, you might picture blue-faced warriors charging into battle, or druids chanting in oak groves, or maybe a moody bagpiper on a windswept hill. And yes, there's some truth in all of that, minus the bagpipes. That's a much later Scottish twist. But the reality of who the Celts were and what they left behind is far more complex. We're talking about a civilization that at its height stretched from the British Isles to the edge of modern-day Turkey. Not a single empire, but a loose-knit cultural network bound by language, art, trade, and myth. They were metalworkers and hill fort builders. They were raiders and traders. They gave Rome a run for its money, literally. And despite the Romans' best efforts to erase them from the map, echoes of the Celts still resonate through European art, language, and legend. In this episode, I'll guide you through the rise of Hallstatt and La Tène cultures, the beating heart of early Celtic civilization, the art, warfare, and society that defined them, and the legacy that survived long after their conquest. So let's unravel the tangled, tribal, and tantalizing world of the Celts, from iron swords and salt mines to spiral motifs and mythology that still haunts modern fantasy. This is not just the story of a people, it's the story of a cultural current, one that refused to be conquered quietly. To understand the Celts, we don't start with kings or kingdoms, we start with salt. Not exactly glamorous, but absolutely essential. Salt was the original preservative. Before refrigeration, before Tupperware, before Best Buy labels, and it was the beating economic heart of the early Celtic world. Our journey begins in Hallstatt, a picturesque lakeside village in modern-day Austria that, around 1200 BC, was anything but quaint. It was a booming trade center thanks to rich salt mines buried deep in the mountains. The Celts didn't just dig salt, they built a civilization around it. By 800 BC, Hallstatt culture had evolved into something far more complex. Hill forts rose across the landscape, weapons and tools transitioned from bronze to iron, and elaborate burial practices revealed a society obsessed with status, lineage, and the afterlife. We find chariots and tombs, swords laid next to skeletal hands, ornate jewelry that suggests either excellent craftsmanship or excellent grave robbing from someone else. This era, what we call the Hallstatt Sea Phase, marks the Iron Age Celts' emergence. And it's where we see the earliest material evidence of what we now call Celtic culture. A warrior elite, tribal hierarchies, trade networks stretching from the Alps to the Atlantic, and a distinctive artistic flair that would only grow louder with time. But around 450 BC, something changes. We enter the La Tène period, named after a lakeside site in Switzerland where archaeologists discovered weapons, tools, jewelry, and a lot of it. If Hallstatt was the foundation, La Tène was the flourish. La Tène Celts were master metalworkers. Think sinuous spiral designs etched into bronze, iron, and gold, shields, helmets, torques. Their visual language was bold, abstract, almost psychedelic. This isn't your tidy Greco-Roman symmetry. La Tène art is all movement and mystery. And while they were certainly artists, they were also aggressive negotiators. The La Tène period saw Celtic tribes expand across Europe, into Iberia, Gaul, the British Isles, the Balkans, even as far as Anatolia. Yes, the Celts made it to modern-day Turkey, where they became known as the Galatians. And yes, those are the same Galatians Paul wrote letters to in the New Testament. File that under things they didn't teach you in Sunday school. What's remarkable is that this expansion wasn't driven by empire building. The Celts didn't conquer in the Roman sense, they radiated. Tribes splintered and settled. They traded, raided, intermarried, and occasionally destabilized entire regions just by showing up. They were warriors, yes, but they were also traders, blacksmiths, brewers, poets, and priests. They were mobile, multilingual, and maddeningly hard to pin down, which I suspect they'd be rather proud of. Up next, we'll follow the Celts into battle, from the sack of Rome to the gates of Delphi, and explore how their enemies feared them, their allies misunderstood them, and their legacy was forged not just in iron, but in defiance. If Hallstatt and La Tène show us the art and soul of the Celts, the battlefield shows us their nerve. To their enemies, the Celts weren't just warriors. They were a natural disaster wrapped in war paint. Let's start in 390 BC, at the infamous Battle of Alea. Rome was still in its awkward early republic phase, trying to establish itself as something more than a cluster of brick houses with ambition. Enter Senones, a Celtic tribe led by a chieftain named Brennus, who, depending on the source, may or may not have been looking for a fight, but he definitely found one. The Roman forces, likely underestimating these barbaric northerners, met them near the Alea River, and within hours, the Celts obliterated them. Rome was sacked, looted, and humiliated. And just to really seal the moment in historical infamy, Brennus supposedly tossed his sword on the Roman scales when asked to accept ransom, uttering the phrase "Vae victisis," which means woe to the vanquished. Now that's some dramatic flair. But what made the Celts so terrifying in battle wasn't just tactics, it was psychology. Ancient sources like Diodorus Siculus and Polybius describe Celtic warriors charging into combat, naked, painted in woad, which is a bluish dye, their hair spiked with lime, their mustaches flaring in the wind. They screamed, they howled, they blew war horns shaped like serpents and other animals. To a Roman soldier raised on discipline and drilled formation, this was a lot. Modern historians debate how accurate these descriptions are, of course, but the consistent message is clear. The Celts knew how to weaponize presence. They weren't just fighting, they were performing. And they didn't stop with Rome. In 297 BC, a massive force of Celtic tribes pushed into Greece, clashing with Macedonian forces and threatening sacred sites like Delphi. Yes, the same Delphi where the oracle dished out a cryptic prophecy. This campaign didn't go quite as well. The Greeks managed to hold them off, and many of the Celtic tribes splintered off towards Thrace and Asia Minor, where they'd eventually settle as the Galatians. Back in the west, the Roman pushback had begun. By 225 BC, Rome was growing tired of Celtic raiders and tribal skirmishes, disrupting their expansionist plans. And by the 2nd century BC, the tide had turned. Rome's machine-like military began absorbing, conquering, or crushing Celtic strongholds across northern Italy, Gaul, and Iberia. And yet, despite mounting losses, the Celts remained an uncomfortably resilient thorn. Their tribal structure made them difficult to fully stamp out. For every village Rome burned, 3 more rose in the forests. What Rome feared most wasn't just the Celtic sword, it was the Celtic spirit, the refusal to be folded neatly into the empire, a culture that wielded chaos not as disorder, but as power. A people who didn't just fight battles, they challenged narratives. And if you're wondering whether that spirit ever fully broke, well, we still have more to explore. Next up, we'll look at the Roman campaigns that finally broke the Celtic stronghold in the West, at least politically, and examine the legendary queen who became a symbol of Celtic defiance, Boudicca. By the 1st century BC, Rome was done playing nice. The Celts had been raiding, resisting, and rebounding for centuries. But the imperial machine doesn't like loose ends. So Julius Caesar, yes, that Julius Caesar, decided it was time to bring Gaul to heel. From 58 to 50 BC, Caesar led a brutal campaign through modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Germany. His Commentary de Bello Gallico, or his personal field notes turned propaganda pamphlet, framed the Celts as a threat to Roman peace and prosperity. In reality, it was a calculated conquest dressed in the language of destiny. The Gallic tribes, for all their bravery and ferocity, were divided. Caesar exploited that, tribe by tribe, until Roman rule dominated what had once been Celtic strongholds. But there was one final flame that burned too bright to ignore. Her name was Boudicca, Queen of the Iceni, a tribe in eastern Britain. Boudicca was never supposed to lead an uprising, but after her husband's death, Rome swooped in, seized lands, flogged her, and assaulted her daughters. They thought they'd squash any rebellion before it started. What they did was forge a legend. Around 60 or 61 AD, Boudicca rallied neighboring tribes and unleashed fury on the Roman occupiers. Her forces torched Camulodunum, which is modern-day Gloucester, Londinium, London, and Verumilia, or St. Albans. Tens of thousands were killed. Roman temples and settlements burned. The empire had met its match, not in a general, but in a mother-turned-avenger. Ultimately, the rebellion was crushed. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinius, regrouped, outmaneuvered Boudicca's forces, and restored imperial control, according to Tacitus. Boudicca took her own life rather than being paraded through Rome in chains. But her story survived, passed down as a symbol of resistance, of Celtic fire in the face of imperial steel. And that's the strange thing about this so-called fall of the Celts. Politically, yes, they lost. Rome absorbed their lands, their hill forts fell, their druids were scattered. But culturally, the Celts refused to vanish. They became part of the bloodstream of medieval Europe. Their knotwork, their myths, their gods, half remembered and reimagined, wove into the stories of Arthurian legend and Christian saints. Their languages, Gaelic, Welsh, and Breton, still echo today, defiant as ever. Because sometimes the loudest stories don't survive in marble statues or epic scrolls. Sometimes they whisper across centuries in poems and symbols, in the names of rivers and hills. So what remains when a people are conquered? The Celts lost their political autonomy, their sacred groves were cut down, their druids silenced, at least officially. And yet, remarkably, the Celts never quite disappeared. They just shifted form. What the Romans couldn't crush was the Celtic imagination, the stories, symbols, and rituals that seeped into the cultural groundwater of Europe. Take language, for instance. Despite centuries of suppression, Celtic tongues like Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, and Breton are still spoken today. They're poetic, complex, and frankly, a bit hostile to beginners, but they carry on an ancient rhythm that refuses to die. Or look at Celtic art. The spirals, knotwork, and abstract animal forms weren't just decorative. They reflected a worldview, cyclical, interconnected, spiritual. These motifs later re-emerged in Christian illuminated manuscripts, most famously the Book of Kells, which is essentially a gospel wrapped in Latin-style doodles. And don't forget the oral tradition. The Romans may have scoffed at the Celts for not writing things down. Druids passed knowledge by memory, not manuscript. But that's exactly how myths survive revolutions: unwritten, ungovernable, and remarkably flexible. From Cu Chulainn to Merlin, Bronwyn to the Morrigan, Celtic deities and heroes live on in folklore, fantasy novels, and late-night Wikipedia rabbit holes. The line between myth and memory may be blurred, but that blur is what makes cultural survival possible. In truth, what makes the Celts so fascinating isn't just their battles or bronze, it's the way they linger. They're like the echo in a forest long after the fire has burned out. You don't always see the source, but you feel it. In a tune, in a tale, in a stubborn sense of identity that outlasts empires. And maybe that's the point. Rome was about domination. The Celts, about continuity. Their story wasn't chiseled into stone, it was carved into memory. The Celts have always defied easy definition. They didn't build empires, they didn't leave behind great libraries, they didn't carve their history into marble or bronze, but somehow, across more than 2 millennia, they've never truly vanished. You can still hear them in a folk song sung in a language imperial powers tried to erase. You can still see them in the swirl of a tattoo, the page of a medieval manuscript, or the spiral carved into an ancient standing stone. You can still feel them in the way myths stick to the landscapes like fog, or how resistance becomes a form of identity passed down through generations. They remind us that history isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's whispered by the survivors. So the next time you hear a Bodrum drum or stumble across a knotwork design on a coffee shop logo, or watch a fantasy hero wield a sword inscribed with strange symbols, take a moment. That's not just style, that's survival. The Celts left no empire, but they left an echo, and if you listen closely, you might just hear it.